So this is the welcome to the third session and the last scheduled session at this point of our joint program between the Boise Center for Religion and American Public Life and the Center for Christian Jewish Learning, talking about religious resources for combating racism. I think that everyone here, except for Yavilah, has been part of at least one of the other sessions, and some of us for all three. Today's special focus is going to be, we've given it the title, Narrative, Restorative Justice, and the Need for Truth in Racial Equity. And in some ways, this is going to spin off very nicely from last week's discussion also. The event is being recorded. The first two sessions are already up on the websites of the Boise Center and the Center for Christian Jewish Learning. So if you want to recommend them to other people or catch up on a session you missed, they are accessible. And I checked last night and the videos are indeed working. So I suppose I don't need to introduce myself because I think I'm familiar. I'm Ruth Langer from the Center for Christian Jewish Learning. And we have today two panelists. We had a conversation last Monday and quite clear that the two panelists are going to feed off of each other in ways that I think are going to be productive for our ongoing conversation. So Yavilah McCoy is our panelist from outside of BC, and she's the CEO of a diversity consulting group called Dimensions Incorporated. This group provides her with an international platform for her work as an anti-racism activist, providing training and educational consulting to numerous social justice projects, to which she brings a uniquely intersectional perspective. In addition to being a leader in the national and interfaith work for racial justice, she's a pioneer of the Jewish diversity and equity movement, and an advocate and mentor for the empowerment of a trans-global community of Jews of color. She was voted one of the 16 faith leaders to watch by the Center for American Progress in Washington, DC, and her bio and list of achievements goes on and on and on. The one I wanted to just pick up because it takes things in a different direction is that she's the writer, producer, and performer of a Jewish gospel theatrical production called The Colors of Water, which celebrates musical traditions passed down through the generations in her African-American Jewish family. So she is one of our speakers, panelists, and the other is Joshua Snyder, who received his PhD in theological ethics from the Boston College Theology Department and is now on our faculty as assistant professor of the practice in theological ethics, and he also directs the Faith, Peace, and Justice minor. Josh's research and writing focuses on transitional justice and Catholic peace building with a focus on the Guatemalan Catholic Church and human rights, peace, justice, and reconciliation, the public context of forgiveness, and comparative truth commissions. And that actually is where I thought we would kick off and have some continuity with last week's discussion, because last week we talked about the situation in South Africa and we raised it and pretty much deferred the conversation of it. My husband and I were in South Africa for a month in 2016, so 4 years ago. And we spent about the last day that we were there, we spent 6 or 7 hours to the point of utter exhaustion in the Apartheid Museum in Soweto near Johannesburg. And that museum pretty much culminates in a celebration of the truth and reconciliation process that had been undertaken under Nelson Mandela in South Africa. But we really left that museum based on our experience in South Africa with really, really heavy hearts, because we had a feeling that this reconciliation process was undertaken and it was sort of sealed and the job wasn't done. Because while we were there, things were falling apart again in different ways. But the there wasn't reconciliation in South Africa in our perception of it. So the question that I wanted to bring to the panelists, and we'll then open it up, is what are the kinds of resources that Judaism and Christianity, specifically Catholic Christianity, bring to this kind of process of reconciliation? And how do we apply this to our American context in a way that might begin to avoid the pitfalls of the South African experience? So Josh or Yavilah?
Sure, I'd be happy to go first. Great to see everyone. I believe everyone hears me well. Yeah, we're good. Excellent, excellent. So before I jump right into that, I just wanted to set out a few key terms for how I understand anti-Black racism, because then that I think will inform what I want to say really about the need for narrative truth and the promotion of restorative justice. So in thinking about, ideas like anti-Black racism, white supremacy, and white privilege, I think it's sort of important to lay out our framework for how we're using these terms. So today, when I'm talking about anti-Black racism, I'm predominantly thinking of it as a form of structural oppression, right? Which means it's embedded in the institutions, practices, and policies of our society. Not particularly looking at it as an individual habit or a form of oppression that's rooted in a particular tyrannical leader, but rather that it's structurally embedded in these institutions, practices, and policies, obviously building here off the work of Iris Young, where structural oppression then is manifested itself. But what's key is to understand that these structures then influence and inform our behavior. So at the individual level, when we think about our ability to act within the world and the choices from which we can choose, it's really important to see that anti-Black racism as structural oppression actually limits our ability to act in a moral way within our society. And I think that has its roots within the ethos of white supremacy. And here, if you had a chance to look over some of the readings I suggested for today, I want to talk about white supremacy, obviously as an ethos that's pervasive in our society, but also as a fundamental theological heresy, right? That white supremacy in and of itself is the failure to acknowledge both Christ and the Trinity. So here working out of some of the insights of James Cone, where white supremacy as a theological heresy is a failure to recognize the imago Dei in our fellow human being. It's a failure to understand the full implications from a Christian perspective of the incarnation. And that has a tremendous impact on how we experience ourselves living in our present society. I also want to just hit briefly on the notion of white privilege. I'm a little cautious about using the term white privilege because I think that it tends to reduce the level of complicity or the level of agency of white folks in our society. I do see white privilege as a manifestation of structural oppression, and in particular, using Iris Young's language, it's a form of exploitation, right? I have a set of privileges that are conferred upon me simply because I'm a white person living in a society, and it's born off the back of persons of color. So it's a form of exploitation. Now, with that sort of brief groundwork of language, in responding to this, I think here's where religious institutions can be key as promoting dialogue within civil society. And here I'm thinking about some of the experiences of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but in particular, the Guatemalan REMI project, which was the recovery of historical memory, which in addition to, there was also in Guatemala, a UN-sponsored Truth Commission. This was actually the Catholic Church's project of the recovery of historical memory. So I think one of the key things in our conversation today is to understand truth as a pivotal first step in moving to try to dismantle anti-Black racism as a structure of oppression, that it's a key first step. That truth in and of itself is a form of justice, and And when I think of truth here, I'm thinking about narrative truth, right? Not the forensic truth that we're requiring in a court of law, but rather truth as a dialogical process where we bring together people in community and allow voices to be heard, where we allow persons of color to speak their experience, their lived experience, and allow that in a public way so that it can become a challenge to Robert Schreiter has this great understanding called the narrative of the lie. And I would say white supremacy is a key narrative of the lie that is told within the United States. And in order to begin to dismantle that, we need to have public opportunities for persons of color to articulate their experience of persecution, experiencing oppression through this, communal practices, communal acts of remembrance, bringing individuals together to engage in these dialogical experiences. Happy to talk more about what I would envision there later, but I would see that as a key first step. And also part of, communal acts of remembrance and the construction of narrative truth is it has to be publicly acknowledged, right? It's great for us to have conversations around topics like this, but unless there is an actual debate in the public square that leads to an acknowledgement of, the experience of white supremacy in the United States, the dialogue's not going far enough. So I think, narrative truth serves as that pivotal first step. Then we can begin to think of things like forgiveness, justice, and reconciliation. For me, when I'm talking about forgiveness, I see it predominantly in terms of being initiated by the forgiver, meaning the one to forgive initiates forgiveness, not the wrongdoer. And in order to begin a process of forgiveness, there has to clearly be an acknowledgement of wrongdoing, which to this day is not really happening in our country. So any talk of forgiveness or, the primacy of the will to restore benevolence or right relationship with your neighbor has to be begun by the person to forgive, not the one to be forgiven. Yes, contrition and admitting a wrongdoing is key, but I don't see that as the first movement. The first movement has to be the forgiver willing to forgive. In that way, the power or agency is restored to the forgiver rather than power being placed in the hands of the one to be forgiven. Justice does not equate forgiveness, right? Forgiveness and justice I see as distinct from one another. Justice as a form of restorative practices can coincide with forgiveness. Think of them sort of as two tracks on a trajectory towards reconciliation, but forgiveness itself is not tantamount to justice. If we're actually looking for reconciliation or the reestablishment of right relationship, the wrong that has been done needs to be addressed in order for reconciliation to be possible. So in the way I'm trying to use these terms, forgiveness and the primacy of the forgiver can precede an act of justice or an official acknowledgement by public or civil society of a wrongdoing. But in order to actually try to move towards the reestablishment of right relationship, reconciliation, we need justice to occur. So those are some of the initial ideas I wanted to put out. And thinking about how this could be implemented, I look to interreligious partners in promoting narrative dialogue. I don't know if we have the political goodwill within our country to actually engage on something like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I don't know if there's the political goodwill for that. And religious communities could actually build or try to get the motion going in terms of working on this at a grassroots level within civil society. So those are just some brief comments. Sorry if I went too long, but hopefully kind of puts out what I'm starting to think about.
Thank you, Josh. You just gave us a whole wealth, I think a whole course on one foot, which is giving us some key points to begin to think about and to come back to. But I first want to give Yavilah a chance to have her moment to put forth what she's about and what she's doing in this direction too. Yeah, you need to unmute.
Thanks, Ruth. So just want to take a minute to talk about the contextualization of spirit and the way I relate to that as a Black Jewish woman. There are various religious concepts that actually were a part of my liberation, meaning I was educated through Jewish parochial schools and went to seminary in Israel and Hebrew University. Um, in Harnof, Jerusalem. But there was a process of me becoming womanist in the context of my religion that actually taught me to be able to be critical and to actually be in conversation with my religious narrative in a way that I'm very excited that Judaism actually welcomed. So, to begin, the first space that Judaism offered me was a relationship with God as woman. Judaism has the concept of God as Shekhinah. And so, because we have a feminine manifestation of God, Arundhati Roy, in the first selection that I sent you, actually is welcomed into my understanding of what it means to hold anti racism in the context of Judaism. Arundhati Roy says, another world is not only possible, she is on her way, and on a quiet day, I can hear her breathing. What that says to me is that the Shekhinah, the day that we speak of as the day of Messiah in Judaism, is Bayomahu Yiyeh Hashem Echad Ushmo Echad. There will be a day when the name of God and the manifestation of God will be one. So if the Shekhinah is the manifestation of God, and for me, the manifestation of God can be understood as the feminine, then I, as a woman in a Black body, get more free every single day that I welcome that God too is a Black woman's body. So that's the first point that I wanted to make about anti-racism. This means that a Black woman's body cannot be owned. How do I come to understand that? Because other concepts in Judaism are of Shemitah and Yovel and Bikurim. And this is that Shemitah is that we are called to in our relationship with the land every 7 years to give of the land back in our relationship with God. And after 7 cycles, we have a cycle called Jubilee, which is a huge celebration in which all slaves go free. Now, Jubilee was also taken in by slaves to commemorate our days of being freed from slavery here in the US. But the fact that that's a concept that's core to Judaism and that it actually is my name Yavilah is a feminization of Jubilee, puts anti-racism directly within a Jewish context for me. It helps me also to have a deep relationship with the indigenous peoples of the land who also believe that land could not be owned. And so your second quote that I sent you, speaking to the work of Joy Harjo, who's an indigenous spiritual teacher, she talks about the conflict between the way in which we, in our narratives of religion, remove things from the earth and allow it to be commoditized. She says that by the rational plundering of the earth, we assume that the earth has no soul, and neither do creatures, and neither do plants or other life forms matter. I belong to a religion that actually values those things. We are not even supposed to eat on the Sabbath before our animals have been fed. So there's a way in which the lack of commercialization and commoditization of the earth that is endemic to white supremacy is not a part of the way our religion teaches us to be liberated. So when we get down to Resma Menachem, the part of narrative for me is also to speak to erasure. How, in the context of religion, do we also participate and are we complicit in erasure? And erasure has, for me, to do with the idea that we don't talk about our history outside of the context of a white supremacist notion. So for us in Judaism, we are guilty of that too. Our history goes back to Pumbedita, Iraq. Our people grew up in the regions of Mesopotamia, the Middle East, and North Africa. And yet in the way in which we are conceptualized within Western civilization, people would assume that Jews predominantly are white and that our history predominantly lives in Europe, when that is actually not true. So when we look at the quote that I gave you from Resma Menachem, my grandmother's hands, the key of embodiment, this idea that through religion we can make our bodies sacred is huge, because in the United States narrative, our bodies were enslaved. And so when our bodies were enslaved physically, our bodies changed. Resma Menachem's grandmother's hands spread from picking cotton. So how do we find the sacred in our embodiment? By going back and not allowing our bodies to have been erased from history. So that's the space where I am critical, and I ask, at least in my tradition, for Jewish scholars to go back and reclaim Africa and to reclaim the Middle East and to reclaim that our Talmud was written in Pumbedita, Iraq, which is a place where people are naturally brown and of color, and to make sure that we don't whiten the narrative in ways that we can't recover from. The other two places that I was told to speak about was truth and reconciliation and restorative justice. The truth is the way in which our narrative speaks to we. When each of us in religion say we, who do we mean? This is a question that I ask of scholars and teachers all the time. If when we say we actually mean white folk, how is that denying the sacred of the body? In terms of the work of Mandela and the discourse and the dialogue that Mandela taught, I was a consultant for the Nelson Mandela Foundation for the past year. And one of the beautiful things he taught about dialogue and Ubuntu was this idea that we have to be in dialogue before we know truth. So again, to bring all areas of the sacred into dialogue with us before we claim to know truth is a very Jewish concept. There's this concept, Shivim Panim LeTorah, that there are 70 faces of the Torah. And what this teaches us is discourse, that all of the Torah has to be in discourse with each other before we can possibly know the truth, which is, if you look at a Talmud page, there's a central text, but that text is in communication with all of the pieces of text around it. The last thing I'll say about justice and the idea of justice is that we have work to do. The call to action for us as Jews is to not be complicit with the way white supremacy has set us up to only be one thing in this country, and to be able to think about the ways in which isms has separated us within our community from our own people, that these times are calling us to push back on the ways in which through religion, racism has been sanctioned and emboldened, and the way in which it is upon us to call out the truths that speak to equal humanity, decency, and compassion. And restorative justice means that you have to be in relationship to do so. Restorative justice teaches that that approach has to have an encounter, and it has to engage in repair, and it has to name what is the harm that has been done that we are trying to repair. So in the name of religion, where do we do better in naming what the harm that has been done in the name of religion is, how that brings us into relationships that require repair, and what is our work every day to do the restorative justice of making sure that we are in right relationship and repairing actual things through our systems that have been harmed. So thank you very much for the ability to be with you today.
Thank you, Yavilah. Thank you, Josh. You also brought us with a wealth of things that I'm sure those that are gathered here would like to pick up on a piece or more and start off a conversation. Jim, you need to unmute.
Thank you. Could I ask Yavilah, that was so powerful. Both your presentations were really powerful. I'm taking notes like crazy. Yavilah, could you please walk us through the part of your talk in which you talked about Shekhinah being manifest and embodied? It reminds me of something that Jacob Neusner wrote about the Second Temple expectation of an incarnation, which I followed up on in Christological. I'm a Christian, so I read that in terms of Christological studies. Could you walk us through those steps again, just quickly?
Well, Shekhinah is a very interesting aspect within Judaism, mostly because we don't believe that God can have a physical form in Judaism. We believe that God is that our God is the God with no shape and no form, and in some cases, not even a name. We use the Tetragrammaton, but that is because God is meant to belong to all of us, and a piece of God is supposed to be inside of all of us through the neshama. So there's a way in which, when we talk about the Shekhinah actually has a body. This Shekhinah is talked about as if it's a feminized presence that rests on people. It's a feminized presence that actually is in the Holy of Holies. There's a way in which, through the feminization of God, we come to be able to relate to be in a physical embodied relationship with God. And so because that is the feminine, when I talk about, or when I look at, you know, the Arundhati Roy, Crow, the idea that the name of God is coming, and that coming of the presence of God is feminized, is beautiful, because I understand in my own femininity and in my own womanist tradition what it means for there to be the presence of a woman in a house. Like whether she's there or whether she is not there, you feel when a woman has presence in the world. And so to connect that to the narrative of God, and to connect this with the idea of that there's something that doesn't have to be seen or named or have shape or form, but that can be felt. That's what I mean when I say anti-racism, the day when we're not commoditizing God, the days when we're not saying God only is in some and in not others, the days when God does not have a form that is white, is a day in which we're embracing anti-racism, and is a day that has context within my religion.
Thank you very much.
Mhm.
Mark?
I have a question about the way that white supremacy or white privilege plays out differently in different religious traditions. I lived in the state of Israel in 94, 95 for 7 months doing some things. And during that time, there were lots of plane loads of Ethiopian Jews arriving who were Black Jews. And it seemed to me, and I know nothing about this, so this is a question from ignorance. My experience of being there, I was living in Jerusalem at the time, is that it seems like a lot of the sort of questions about welcoming or not welcoming them, or welcoming or not welcoming these Ethiopian Jews to synagogues that were already established, sort of replicated the kind of stuff that Christian churches were doing, you know, in the American South and indeed in the American North. So do you think that white privilege plays out the same across religious traditions, or is there something structurally about race there, or do you think it's different between, say, Christian stuff in the United States and Jewish stuff in the state of Israel?
Josh, do you want to talk about that? You don't know? Mhm.
I'll let you field that one.
What I would say about white supremacy in the Middle East period is that we often don't talk about the impact of the Crusades on the formation of the Middle East, and we don't talk about the idea of the hierarchy of value that was created by creating Christians and Moors, yes, of contextualizing Arab civilizations as savage. That too was white supremacy. And so in the context of the way in which the Middle East was formed itself, and also in the context of the way the state of Israel was formed itself, there were white supremacy habits that were in place, both in terms of internally, the way Yemenites and Moroccans and people from Africa and North Africa were treated through the absorption process, and Ethiopians, even in more modern day terms, and also in the hierarchy of value, in the way in which people who did come from Europe took on Hebraicized names, took on the culture of Africa and the Middle East, and in some ways co-opted the culture that was indigenous to the space. So is that colonization? Are there ways in which we have to do work to get out of the shadow of white supremacy as, you know, Jews and as people who live in the state of Israel? Absolutely.
So
I think
Yavilah, how would
every
you answer
culture
that?
has to be in relationship with its narrative, and to not assume that any of us didn't grow up in this very large footprint and large shadow that white supremacy has been casting on our world since the turn of the century. We're all complicit. So, I mean, if you've read Caste, you know, Case by Isabel Wilkerson, you know that there's a way in which we have work to do because of the way religion itself was formed systematically.
So you would typify that as an example of colonization? You raised a
I
question.
don't know, because I also don't want to get into the political of it. What I want to do is be in relationship and accountability and responsibility to my relationship to history. And I talk more about the narrative. When we read books, when we look at the discourse, when we talk about the formation of the state of Israel, are we looking for and telling the stories of how white supremacy had influence? That is rare in my religious practice and among religious discourse of scholars. And so I do it because I can't escape it. I'm a Black woman in a Black body. I got to talk about white supremacy so I could get free. So.
Yeah, I think it's really valuable for us to be pointing to an internal issue within the Jewish community, which is really, really complicated because Jews were not considered white in Europe until they had the opportunities to become white with emancipation. And then because it was the way to get ahead, because European Jews could pass, in many cases, Jews came to think about themselves as white and to act as white. And that has, as Yavilah said, has enormous implications in Israel, the Ethiopians being only the most complex of them because in addition to being Black, Ethiopian Jews have a Judaism which is substantially, which grew up substantially, completely divorced really from Rabbinic Judaism. So that the issues of culture and skin color are layered by this question of what Judaism itself actually is in a different way that goes very, very deep and is very complicated. So that I think in many ways to think about the issues within contemporary Jewish society and especially in Israeli society, as Yavilah said, to point to that European hegemony over Jews from Arab lands or Arab and Muslim lands is actually the deeper problem. But that's substantially in Israel, not entirely, but the question is, we're sitting here in the United States now, and we're dealing with a national moment of crisis. This is one of the many dimensions of crisis of our country right now, but in many ways a very important one. And how do we take this consciousness? How do we develop it? How do we hear these narratives and do things? And then one of the readings said, doing is exactly the wrong question to be asking. But it is also where my gut sort of goes, because that's my problem still. Eric, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, thank you both for your talks. Josh is a friend and colleague, and I've known how great he is. Yavilah, it's a pleasure to encounter you for the first time here, and thank you for your time. Really appreciate what you had to say. I'm the Mandela. The fact that you are working with the Mandela Foundation is really cool, and I think your invocation of his comment about that we need to dialogue to know the truth is very powerful. It's profound and simple at the same time, and perhaps that's why it's profound, And I think that it makes me to bring it back to the U.S. context a little bit. If coincidentally you mentioned Wilkerson's book, I taught a good chunk of her caste book yesterday in my class, and one of the things that she talks about is how easy evil is on the high caste members of society. How all of the mechanisms of caste make moving through that space very simple for someone like me in our culture to ignore. And so bringing it back into the dialogue portion, I wonder, we've spent the last 5 years in the US talking about, how did a certain group of elites, or how did the whole group of white people or whatever not have a dialogue with one another about the polarization that brought us Donald Trump. And all of these, books, whether it was Hillbilly Elegy or What's Wrong with Kansas, or all these other books have come out trying to engage in a certain kind of dialogue. And I wonder, this is an open question for everybody really in the group, is just as a conversation point, how hard should dialogue be? If one of the claims of one of the truths of caste is that we make it easy on ourselves, and so talking to people like ourselves is easy, and or staying within a caste is easy, and not taking on the hard questions. What would that look like to be in a kind of hard dialogue that moves us, that makes that helps blur the boundaries of caste or break down the substructures that she talks about? What kind of hard conversations need to take place that aren't easy, and who needs to be a part of them? We could say everyone, but when we think about, in particular, what do those conversations need to look like? I spent some time, I'm interested in citizenship and civic engagement questions and how religion relates to that as well. But there's a feeling, I guess, in my mind of how hard it is to create a civic culture while also having these really hard conversations, because we're part of the push is to incline ourselves to still remain in contact with people who have radically different political positionality or votes on or responses to Black Lives Matter or whatever. We still need to be neighbors, and we're called to be neighbors from our religious traditions as well. And yet hard conversations need to happen. So anyway, I'd love to hear reflections from you all and from others about what kinds of truths come out of these hard conversations and how we ought to have them.
I have I'm constantly battling some reservations from my own positionality regarding some of the incitement to discourse, if you will. So I really appreciate Josh's reiterations that in order for a restorative justice framework to take place, that there has to be that someone who has committed harm cannot then control whether or not they receive forgiveness or what justice looks like, or it can that the processes and the discourse and the interchanges cannot be on someone who has committed harm's terms, which would seem obvious, but is actually so difficult to communicate in an instance of violence. And part of that difficulty, I think, I think that there are two issues that I'm constantly battling. One, whose labor is this supposed to be anyway? To the catch-22 of wanting and needing representation, of wanting to listen to different kinds of voices, of wanting different people to be involved in conversation. Eric, as you're talking about what kind of conversations do we need to have, the importance of presence, right? Like and witness, if you will, in order to lead to something that we might refer to as some sort of confession or sensibility around accountability. But also that is a lot of work. That's asking people who've been harmed to do more work, asking folks who are often frequently exhausted. And I mean exhausted in the broader necropolitical framework of I'm not tired, I am exhausted by what is required to live under, consistent and very ubiquitous and widespread, various regimes, if you will. I'm not unwilling to use that term in our country or elsewhere right now, of oppression. So how do you manage that without also asking to extract labor from those who are already overworked in a system that is meant and designed and has effectively been consuming them and consuming people's narratives, particularly along lines of race. And then when we get into all of the nuances of that, that all Black lives, matter is something that has to even be further, Black women's lives, Black trans women's lives, Black, differently abled lives, all of these different, Black incarcerated lives, what all of these things look like and matter. And I think that a part of the problem or the issue and the concern for me still resides around how individual how our imaginations are captured by individual narratives. even the need to sort of be a bleeding heart. Like, how many times do I have to tell this horrible story of what has happened to me? How many times do I have to, perform a certain kind of drama, in order to elicit sympathy or empathy or willingness to dialogue? But more so than that, the ability to deny, plausible deniability of individual actions. Well, the call to be a neighbor is one thing, but we are also talking, as Josh said, about these structural issues. The problem isn't, are you my neighbor? The problem is the whole neighborhood. The problem is, that it's gated. The problem are the HOA fees. The problem are the application screening. And so we have, these different tiers of problems, or these different tiers, these different aspects, these layers of structure. We have vestibules and we have, altars that are deeply entrenched in the issues of racism. And so when I think about our religious resources, what does it mean for, all of the book groups and all of the ways that people are dialoguing interpersonally? But what does it mean to really think about larger scale modeling and instruction? Have we really apologized, Yavilah, for the Crusades? Have we apologized for colonialism? You can't get an apology for slavery, right? Like Donald Trump is saying that, he's the best president, except maybe other than Abraham Lincoln. We can't, and it's because people don't feel or don't consider themselves products of or deeply entrenched in these various systems. So my question about narratives and changing is, one, what do we do in a world, and particularly in the US, where narrative and facts have lost meaning, that discourse has lost meaning, that empathy is lost, particularly in our cyclical exposures to violence and willingness to violence and lack of structural accountability, right? I have many ethical questions around the justice system, but the lack of indictments, the lack of accountability held to those who, represent the state in particular ways. But also, how do we recover or think about narrative when it also seems that relationships don't matter either? I really wonder if people want to be in community or care. And so obviously our religious structures create that space, but I think that we have to address that wanting or desiring or feeling called to community has become far more countercultural than we realize, or that we've been necessarily able to interrogate to say, hey, actually, we have a lot of people who want to be alone and who want to be alone and racist and who want to be alone and racist and have a militia. Like, how are we going to deal with that? But also, how are we going to be, communities that take that into account as well, in terms of what are we doing here when we gather and worship?
I think we all need to sit with your words, Amy Victoria. I just wanted to throw in one thing which is going through my mind, which is the example which comes from the Second Vatican Council and the repair of relations between Catholics and other religions, which is that really it took a crisis. It took the Holocaust, and then took one very, very brave man, Jules Isaac, to go to Pope John the 23rd and say, hey, here's a list of all the things that have created the problem. And then the Catholic Church had an authority structure by which to begin a response that, what we're talking 55 years later, is nowhere near completed, but they did result in at least an official change to narrative. So we have, I think we can look to a certain extent to that example as, I mean, God forbid that we have that kind of crisis, but that maybe we are in a point which is saying to enough people and enough people in positions of being able to respond, that that list of that narrative is something that requires a changing to the larger cultural narrative, and a beginning to work together for this. But we don't have the structure of the Vatican there to say, you know, here's a council, here's something the council needs to do to answer. And that's part of the challenge that I'm hearing in what you said. Elizabeth, I saw you had your hand up, I think.
No, it just brought a smile to my face when I heard Amy say labor, who's going to do the work of labor. It made me think of Yavilah's comments, and right away I thought LABOUR. I think there's a potential womanization or feminization aspect of that. And I do think, actually, I'm really hopeful to rewrite historical narratives to talk about how religion has been weaponized as a tool of political violence, whether in the Middle Ages or whether for oppression through empires. And again, in a way maybe we've never seen in one of the most violent stages as part of the nation state. And how do we detangle some of those messages in a time when identity is more important seemingly than ever in terms of political stakes? I don't know where those spaces are, but we have to rewrite the narrative in a truthful way that recognizes our heritage, what the legacy is in the present day, even in the US, from places abroad.
And we have to make that part of our education system, both formal and informal, right? So informal meaning things like movies, right? Television shows and whatever, and formal meaning, school and university and religious education. I mean, all of those. And in a way that causes people to listen, right? I mean, the listening being more important than doing. Yeah, that was one of the, that was a big message in one of those papers, right? And that, making that happen, I mean, that may be the thing that we need to be doing.
There's a way in which I think the conversation has to start around power too, because it's one thing to wait for large systems to come down with a decision or to right the sins of racism. That's one way to do this. Another thing is to reconceive what our religions and what our narratives have taught us power actually is. Is power something that has to do with ownership? Is power about commoditization? Or is power about the ability to act as one over or one above others? Or is power just inherent in our humanity? Religion, the best of what religion was supposed to teach us is that we were born powerful and that we retain that power as we deepen our connection to humanity and dignity through relationship with the Creator. So there's a way in which, if we're going to go from restorative justice, the very first thing is to restore some type of human sense of power. And while doing that, name where humanity and dignity has been robbed in the name of power through religion. Now, nobody made anybody go marching across from London down to Mesopotamia to do a crusade. That was because not just in the name of religion, that was also done in the name of money, because it was prosperous and because it brought a hell of a lot of money to the church. And there's ways in which our institutions have also been formed to make a God out of money and to make a God out of the way in which we can power over other peoples. So, Amy, you're talking about like, in what condition do we arrive at the table of restorative justice? And are we too tired to even contemplate what it's going to mean to wait for a bunch of people in religious and broader spaces with institutional power to give us our due? I say they never really had it. It was a lie from the beginning. And so since it was a lie, I'm not waiting for institutions. I'm doing my best to tell the truth on an everyday in the name of religion. And as I do that, what I'm asking for people to do is to trouble the waters around power. If you have power, give it up. If you think that the way in which you are most connected to your religion is through your title or through your parish or through the way in which you power over other people, where are you doing the work through religion to equalize power among us so that those who have been historically targeted in our spaces can rest, can get enough breath in their lungs to tell you the truth about their power in their humanity? So, restorative justice starts with name and harm. You can't be in relationship with a harm that you can't name. Isabel Wilkerson said that just the other night. If we can't even talk about racism in this country, how are we ever going to be able to do the work of cleaning it up? If within our religious spaces, it has been taboo as long as it's been to talk about white supremacy, how are we ever going to name our white supremacy habits? Those are the things that are making us tired, that white supremacy has been with us for 300 years. That is a reason to be tired. That's a long time. And yet we are still here. So if I'm here, I'm resilient already. I'm deeply powerful because you didn't get to kill me. Me and my generation survived. So we are super powerful. I don't need to hear any lies about that. What I do need to know is, how are you going to help me not to come to your table and lose power? Every time we have a conversation with white supremacy and white supremacy habits and the history of the twin genocide that formed this country, the genocide of the Native Americans and the enslavement of Africans. That's a twin genocide that gave birth to the United States of America. As long as it stays true that we can't talk about that in religious and broader spaces, you're creating a situation in which I will remain tied. So I say start by telling the truth, and then go from truth to the reconciliation of repair. And in that repair, hold your direct accountability to harm, actual harm that has been caused to people. And don't ask us to just come and hug each other and sing kumbaya. Start with the repair of harm, which means you got to name it in order to claim it. So that's what I would say about that.
And Yavilah, I'm conscious of the fact that you need to be somewhere in 3 minutes.
I'm actually going to jet right now. On that note, do we drop the mic? Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Appreciate the ability to be with you. Enjoy the rest of your conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Janet.
I think I totally agree with what Yavilah says, except that I think it's not so easy. I mean, she didn't think it's easy either, but I think that telling, right, doesn't necessarily mean that people will hear, right? And that's why I said that I thought that maybe as allies, what we're responsible for is somehow figuring out how to help people learn to hear.
Josh, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, just to pick up on that note of telling the truth and positions of power, I think it's really important to especially learn insights from the last 20 years of the need for a place-based approach. And what I mean from that is place as the center from which we do the work of dismantling anti-Black racism. What is the epistemological center from which we're engaging in this discourse, right? If the epistemological center is from that of the white supremacist or the oppressor, as we've pointed out, we're already in a problematic location, because those in the position of privilege are not going to be the ones that necessarily are going to try to dismantle that. So a place-based approach needs to look to the margins of society. Again, not in the sense of placing more work on those who have already been oppressed, but in the sense of those are the voices that need to be heard, and making sure that they are amplified. And what are the institutions in place that can amplify those? So to the point of the power of religious institutions, besides having an amazing hierarchy, the Catholic Church has a tremendous connection of low-level grassroots churches and non-governmental agencies, right? So there's a way in which by using parish systems and by engaging in an ethic of encounter, where you just try to begin solidarity through proximity with encounter with those who have been oppressed, you can begin on a much more grassroots place-based approach to hearing narratives than to expect the church from on high to have, that brave figure that's going to say, yes, we have, Francis in place, let's have Francis do the work. No, it's got to be the work of local parishes. And that's why I think a place-based approach really acknowledges the power of the parish as a primary agent in forming the religious community. Unfortunately, I mean, all of us who teach college students, like their formative experience of experiencing church at a college is radically different from their formative experience of experiencing church at home, right? And that's something we need to lament and try to address. So let's call back the power of the local parish for building up those who are concerned with these issues and using that as an opportunity to change the epistemological center from which we engage these questions, to look for voices on the margins that can do it. So that was just a brief thing I wanted to point out.
So one of the things that came up in the first session was that the Archbishop in Boston had put out a letter to be read in all the different churches, and it wasn't. Right. So that's, again, one of those same things, how you got to somehow organize to get people to hear. Right. And to appreciate.
Martin Luther King said in the 1950s that Sunday morning at 10 a.m. is the most racially segregated hour of the week in the United States. I think that's still true, actually. The Catholic churches I go to are basically, Anglo, white, and the churches that are in Roxbury are primarily African American or Black, other, Haitian or other. So I don't think that has changed at all in half a century. It's a racially segregated, the hour of worship is the most racially segregated hour of the entire week. And that's an important fact. I mean,
And I've had, more than one, not BC, but more than one, Catholic colleague and intellectual defend that because of parochial principles and the fact that I can't help where I live. And so what that indicates to me is that there are ways that we, and when I, Yavilah, we, everybody, I mean the collective American consciousness, we, even though I do think it has global implications as well, there are ways that we in this country are able, again, to compartmentalize our lives and use that to justify the lack of relationships or the lack of time or the lack of accessibility to particular kinds of conversations, which is really an excuse for, not wanting to embark on particular kinds of work. Yes, we need to listen to one another, but I think that that's a complicated, we need to listen, stop doing stuff. And I'm like, well, you're not listening, so maybe you should do something, very, very, you guys remember that John Q and I don't, the actor's like, do something, sometimes that's where I find myself. No, I want somebody else to do something. And I feel that way. Obviously, there are no limits to the multiple ways and angles that racism has to be addressed. And so I see a lot of individual efforts, and I do think that groundswell and that grassroots is particularly important. I think that there's so much historical precedent for that. But there's also, because we do not want, to continue for our religious spaces to address racism, to address sexism, to address all these isms, with all deliberate speed, or when they find time in their liturgical calendar, that when there are structures that have been arbiters of oppression, that it also is significant for our systems to make claims, and for folks who do have power, to also articulate, our complicity and our need to engage and interact. In part because, a personal experience to a degree, but I for as much racism and sexism and so much that I've personally experienced and that I see in this country, I also recognize the privilege that I have to be able to have different kinds of conversations, or to be in spaces, or even to be in a space where, whether they like it or not, whether they evaluate me positively or not, like the students are, you're going to hear what I have to say today in class, like I have a particular, it's not large in some respects, but it's larger than some of my neighbors here in Newark, New Jersey, right? Like it's larger than, some of the essential workers who have been out, in these pandemic streets, if you will. It's larger, and has more, more access than so many people who will not get particular kinds of platforms to be heard, will not necessarily have the same kinds of vocational opportunities to make claims. So that for me requires and asks me to be accountable in certain kinds of ways, and in my work and in my life. But it also, continues to humble me, and keep me, um, keep me on fire or in other people's ears as well, that we need the change and the energies coming from, on high and from, all directions. We really do, because so many of the solutions, or so many of the proposals, I think, make assumptions about one or the other. And it's like, well, actually, what would it look like for all of this to be working together and working in tandem? Like, what would it look like for the Archbishop's letter to be read, to be heard, to be sounded, but then also to be discussed, to be taken home, to be shared in different kinds of ways? And how can we continue to press, for that sort of extensive, extensive strategy of change, and moving towards something better than where we are now? Can anybody get Fox News to change? What if, sorry.
Jim.
Thanks. I want to answer Amy's question, but I've had another question that to step back from. I want to say that one thing that the Catholic Church has is that, frankly, you can bang heads together because of your your hierarchical system. One thing that the Episcopal Church has been doing is based on, I'm trying to remember, it's a word taken from South Africa. I can't remember the word, but what we've been doing is having triplets of parishes from different parts of our dioceses who are placed together by the diocese in relationship. And they send a delegation from one parish to another to share worship on Sundays. Some of the members of that delegation stay overnight in hosts' homes, and they revolve around, and they spend the weekend learning about each other's ministries and so forth. The Catholic Church has all kinds of resources, and frankly, I have not been impressed at the, well, wouldn't it be nice approach that seems to be the bishop's default. If you Catholics wanted to do something, you would do it. And I mean, you know how to get the bishops to, mobilize around certain issues, but this parish sharing system is very, very simple. Precisely because of your governance structure, what becomes so blindingly obvious is that there really is no political will among the bishops. Having delivered myself of that, thank you. I apologize if I've stepped on any toes. Maybe they needed to be stepped on. But I have a different question, which I wanted to raise, especially since Josh opened on forgiveness. There seems to me to be a very pernicious kind of spirituality of forgiveness going around, which I call therapeutic forgiveness. I'm going to forgive you because I'll feel better. I'll take the burden off my shoulders. Nothing will change. You won't have to admit your fault. I may not even tell you I'm forgiving you, but I'm forgiving you because I need to move on. I'm sure you've encountered all of this. There is a wonderful theologian at Yale Divinity School. I'm blocking on his name. It's a long German name. Somebody might recall it, who has written extensively on this phenomenon, calling for what he calls a more robust doctrine of forgiveness. I'm just wondering if, since many of you are involved in actual church life, do you encounter what I call this therapeutic notion of forgiveness, which seems to me to be just walking away from any forgiveness that requires something of the perpetrator, that actually changes and moves us back toward right relationship?
It's too bad that Josh had to go to teach, so he can't pick up on this.
Yeah.
I mean, this is reminding me of the classic discussion. There's a Jewish Christian discussion in Simon Wiesenthal's The Sunflower, and so this is a case where, is everyone familiar with it? Or yes, no. Basically, he posits a case, don't remember whether it's true or not, where a Nazi comes to a group of Jews who are, I believe, still in a concentration camp, and saying, "I'm about to die. I really need your forgiveness." And then he takes us to various Jews, Christians, and say, "How would you answer this?" And it basically, the Christian answers say, "Oh, of course he needs to they need to forgive, or the Jews need to forgive the Nazi because of this therapeutic forgiveness." And the Jewish answers are almost entirely, his crime is not one that we have the right to forgive because it was not committed against us. And so we're actually bumping up against two very, very different concepts of this dynamic of sin and forgiveness. That the Jewish teaching is very much that I have the power to forgive something that was committed against me, but forgiveness is not the right mode for healing the larger problem when I'm a third party to it.
Oh, and when it's structural.
Yeah,
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So that it's not to say that the problem should not be addressed, but that mode of that the sinner needs to repent, but the person offering forgiveness, the human offering forgiveness, the only person who can do that is the one who has actually been harmed.
yeah,
So if that harm was against my grandparents or against somebody, somebody completely unrelated, then I have no power to be the one granting the absolution that comes with that, with my forgiveness.
the theologian at Yale that I was trying to think of, his name is Nicholas Wolterstorff, and he talks a lot about and I think also Charles Griswold, who has written a major work on forgiveness from a philosophical, not a religious perspective. He teaches at BU, and he's got a very thick volume on forgiveness that I hope to read during my next sabbatical. But they both say that one cannot forgive on behalf of the dead. That if justice is owed to the dead, it is not for the living to offer forgiveness. You can do other sorts of things, but properly speaking, only the victim can forgive.
Which just throws another layer of complexity into our entire discussion. I think we're running out of time. We've opened up a lot of cans of, they're not of worms, they're jars of issues and emotional intensity, spiritual intensity, questions that really, really matter to all of us in different ways and in different directions, but that we need to have on our table and as faculty at BC to put on our students' table as well.
I wonder if we want to continue having these discussions, in particular about what the implications are for from what we've learned, what is our advice to BC, okay? And then what are the implications for our programs and our courses and whatever. I mean, I had two reasons to come here. One is because I'm interested in this. And the other is because I'm heading up a program where we're teaching people to design learning experiences. And I want to make sure that those learning experiences are just. They're not just inclusive, but they're just.
I didn't pay Janet to say this, but actually just this morning, I was thinking about what to do from here. I have not brought this up with Ruth, who's been a wonderful collaborator, but I will bring this up soon to maybe do this in a more focused way. I think when Ruth and I began talking about this seminar, we talked about it, what can we bring precisely to the question that Janet had, which is what can we bring to Boston College?
We talked about it in the first session, but we haven't talked about it since.
So I think I'd like to continue. Why don't we say that certainly Ruth and I have not had this conversation, so I'm kind of springing this on her. But I think I would be very interested in continuing it in a more practical, focused way about what does this mean for us as BC people, and how can we help that conversation along? We're part of a much larger initiative headed by Vince Rougeau. How can we help Vince in having this conversation more broadly within Boston College? So let's say that's an open-ended question, and stay tuned for more. So.
And what can we be doing I'm thinking about what can we be doing in terms of creating our programs as well.
Yeah, it may be that it's a conversation that needs to be had discipline by discipline to a certain extent. I think there's lots of different dimensions to this question, but maybe we will have this conversation also.
But I'm thinking you guys can help me.
Well, no, I mean, but we need the questions as much as we need the answers, right?
I've got to go because we're in a very short while. We're doing a webinar on Pope Francis's new encyclical, so I have to go and prepare my hat, put on a completely different hat for that. But I want to thank you all. I've actually learned quite a bit from all of this, and the conversation has been very rich and deep, and I'm glad we're recording it because I think I'll send all three out to various people I know who are interested. So thank you all very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
And our speakers are no longer here, so I can't thank them to their faces, but I could definitely thank them for the richness that they brought to today's discussion, both to Josh and Yavilah. So thank you all, and you'll be hearing from us again, I'm sure.
Good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Healthy.
Thank you.
Bye.